Tokyo Alumni podcast. So this is the second episode of a 5-episode series. This is a focus on international schools in Japan. I've wanted to make this video for a long time, actually, because many people, especially the older I get, ask me, what is the international school scene like? I have kids in Tokyo. Where should they go? Where are the best schools, etc. So I hope these next 12 minutes or so will help people understand better the international school scene in Japan, primarily Tokyo. And yeah, here we go. Is how many international schools are there? And you'll find websites that say 80, 100, 120. And this is because by nature, international schools are kind of abstract. There are different types of schools, different types of curriculums. There's IB, AP, got British schools, Australian schools, etc. So one way, though, to try to objectively measure this is through organizations such as
international schools. So this group has membership criteria. I'll post a link to the video, but it includes things like, having agencies that have inspected already, like Council of International Schools, Western accreditation of schools and colleges. There has to be some sort of accreditation, some type of curriculum that is fully articulated on their website, with curriculum coordinators, that everything is in English. Again, we're not going to go through all of this, but here, they have a set of membership requirements, and schools can apply to join this group of schools. So what group of schools are on this list of Japan Council of International Schools? So this comes up to a total of about 30 schools, I think 29 to be exact. Notable exemptions are the DODS schools, so the military-based schools, Kadena, Kubasaki, and Okinawa. You have schools on the mainland, like Zama, Yokosuka. These are not part of the JCIS. They are American schools, in technically what would be America. The military bases are not part of Japan. So these 29 schools, you can see a lion's share of them are basically Tokyo, Osaka, with just a few outside of those two major cities. And then essentially Hokkaido International School. There's two campuses, but essentially the same school up here in the north. So for my video, I will focus primarily on these 29 schools. There are a few that are probably worth touching upon later on the video, like there's a new school up in Appi. It is a newer school, but it is part of the Harrow school family. So it's up in Iwate Prefecture. And yeah, it's notable because it is the most expensive international school in Japan at almost 1,000 a year. So more than triple the second most expensive school. And finally, UWC, United World Colleges. Part of their family has a school in Karuizawa, which is also worth mentioning. So that said, let's go. So there's a bunch of factors when we consider what makes an international school great. We have everything from the facilities to the quality of faculty, the quality of extracurriculars, student support services, the culture of the school, and all of that counts. But I want to focus on what would be objective and measurable. And I want to start with perhaps what is one of the main questions as well. How is this educational experience going to help my student post K through 12 education? And what I strongly recommend parents to do is to look for what is called school profile. So you can find it quite easily. Just type in school name, school profile, and PDF, and you can find it. School in Tokyo, and you can get objective data, especially things like what colleges students have gone to. Here's another one. Here's St. Mary's. So they're an IB school, so they're fully transparent with how their IB schools compare to other IB schools in the world. They also have here information about what college their students attend. Here's another one, Yokohama International School, a small school in Yokohama, but very popular. And again, they have kind of data here about their school. You have here, I think this was, Fukuoka International School, very, very small school, but you have their college acceptances. And you have here Seisen. You can click on their school profile, and again, kind of reminiscent of these other schools. So as I looked school to school, different profiles, as I did research, it was actually a great exercise for myself to reevaluate sort of what makes a great school. Is it the facilities? Is it the faculty? Is it a diverse group of students? Is it simply proximity, how close it is to the city? So I wanted to look at it through a multitude of lenses, but I think the most important for many parents is academics, right? How rigorous is the academics?
how much are these academics going to prepare my child for college and beyond college. And these are very difficult things to measure because you have different curriculums, like IB versus AP, if you look at one of my previous videos, British schools, Australian schools, French schools. But there is one way to compare a lot of these schools, and that is the SAT. So the SAT, which stands for the Scholastic Assessment Test, is taken by about 2 million students each year, and it's standardized. So everyone is taking the same level test. Of course, it does have criticisms, like it's just one test. With that said, it's a strong predictor of college success, and it's perhaps one of the only constants that we can use to compare students from one school to another. So through the use of ChatGPT as well as some individual research, because some of the schools weren't available, I was able to compile the following list. So this here is what I was able to compile. Keep in mind, some of this data comes from 4 years ago for certain schools versus other schools it's 1 year ago. But overall, we do see some patterns emerging. So you kind of have ASIJ and UWC, kind of a class of their own. So 1450. This is the equivalent to very elite prep schools in the United States. And then you kind of see the next group of clusters of school, Canadian Academy, where many people tout this as the best international school on the west side of Japan, joined with schools like St. Mary's, British School in Tokyo, which they've recently opened up a really nice new campus, Seisen, and CAJ. Now keep in mind, we're talking averages here though. So there's plenty of students at Seisen who get higher scores than kids at ASIJ and UWC, and vice versa. At 8YS, this would definitely be with an asterisk because most recently on their school profile, they've indicated they simply don't share the SAT scores because not enough students take it. So my presumption is this data is from several years back. And then at the end, not to pick on these guys, but you have Aoba and Hokkaido with about 1150 each, which are still, it's above average, but there is some distance between, let's say, Aoba and St. Mary's. And of course, most notable is most schools don't share this data or don't have enough students that take the SATs. So that's one measurement. That's it. Just simply one measurement is SAT. And as I mentioned a second ago, the negatives are, it's just one test. The positives, though, are it is standardized. Whatever the students at UWC took is the same test the kids at CAJ took. So that's one measurement. So let's move on to the next one.
Rigor is their average IB score. This actually had to go back and re-record this section because the IB scores online for each school is kind of all over the place. Some schools have now updated their IB scores. Other schools, their IB scores are a few years old, but this was the best I can find. As you can see, K International schools kind of in a league of their own with 41, which is quite outstanding. Then you have St. Mary's, UWC, and so all these schools are much above average. And as you can see, there's about the same number of schools with SAT scores available. It's the same thing with IB schools. Obviously, not only are some of these schools not IB schools, but some of them are AP. So most schools don't have an IB score. And as you can see, Fukuoka St. Moore, these are not necessarily bad scores at all. These are pretty decent IB scores. It's out of 45. But you can see that there's some deviation between the higher schools and the lower schools when it comes to IB score averages. Another thing to keep in mind is that at some schools, every student has to take DP. Other schools, it's optional. So that in some ways can affect scores as well. Is school size. So this actually might not seem super important, but I think you need a minimum to do certain things. And what I mean minimum is you want a certain number of students in your high school to run a proper, for example, soccer team. If you want 20 boys and 20 girls, very difficult to do when you only have 40 boys and 40 girls in your whole high school. Same goes with musicals and plays. You need a decent pool of talent, as well as just simply numbers to run any decent program. So at least in my mind, I feel like 200 is a pretty good number. So you'll see there's a few pretty big ones like ASIJ and Harrow and YS. And then you have schools like St. Mary's, BST. And then the cutoff, as you can see, is about around this 11th, 12th area. Once you start getting past 12, 13, you're talking 40 kids a grade, then you're talking 50 kids a grade. Things start to, I'll say even less, that's 25 students a grade. It becomes very limited in regards to what you can do, especially when it becomes to after school programs. So that's another thing to consider when you are choosing where to send your child. Unlike large public schools in the States that can be 2,000 kids, 3,000, as you can see, no schools in Tokyo or Japan are that large. I think international schools in general, there's very few examples of this, with a few exceptions like Singapore American School, which I believe is more than double the largest school in Japan, which is ASIJ. So another point to consider. The campus size is also something one should consider. Kind of like school population, larger campus allows you to do certain things smaller campuses wouldn't. And first, second, we kind of have our notable exceptions. We have UWC, which is in Karuizawa. You have Harrow, which is way up in Iwate. And then third and fourth, even these guys, technically this is in Tokyo, but ASIJ is way out west, so way outside of the city center. Okinawa is in its own island. Canadian Academy is in Kobe, which, no offense to Kobe, but again, it's not really the same as Osaka or Tokyo. So once we're talking about more major areas, we're pretty much talking about 6th to 10th here. So you've got places like YS, largest in Yokohama. Then you have BST, which now has the largest, at least in campus size, in Tokyo. Then you have older schools like St. Mary's, Seisen, ISSH. So it seems like 10,000 is about what you want at least to have decent, like at least to have your own field, whether it's like Osaka International or Aoba. And then once you start getting to 15th and under, you're starting to get pretty small campuses, pretty limited in regards to what you can do with field space. And then about 5,000 seems to be sort of the lower end in regards to school size. Important for some parents, the cost. So we always have a noticeable outlier here, Harrow. So it's a new school up in Iwate. They're almost Isenman, so about 60 grand. And then you have ASIJ, which has been for a long time the most expensive school in Japan for international schools. And then you have UWC. And keep in mind, these are approximate. I did look at some of these schools specifically on their websites, and it's hard to calculate because sometimes there are things like entrance fees that cost 50 mon, like $4,000. So with that said, what's important are the trends. So these schools up here are definitely more expensive than these schools here, who are more expensive than these schools here. And I think what's very notable is the range. You're talking about more expensive schools being 400 man, 350 man, so about $25,000. But you also have schools that are slightly more reasonable, which are closer to 200 man, about $15,000. And then you have some schools that are very reasonable, like Fukuoka or Hiroshima. We're talking close to $10,000. One thing to keep in mind is a private school in Tokyo at the high school level is usually about $5,000 to $10,000. So what that means is your uppermost expensive private schools like Shiritsu in Tokyo is about the same as your cheapest and most reasonably priced schools for international schools. So just giving you an idea of how expensive it is to attend international schools. Of course, this is not including things like a lot of these schools are in international leagues. So if they have to travel to Korea to play sports games, or they have to travel, to Europe for a music competition, that is not included in the fees here. So I do believe this is definitely one of the major factors many parents should consider is how much, because there is a big gap, between paying, over 400 man, over 30 grand for ASIJ versus paying, under 200 man for K International School, paying just over 10 grand for K International School. They're still getting an international school education. And there's more than a double or close to double of a difference in tuition. So I will try my best in 2 minutes to summarize the trends of international schools. So something really important to keep in mind is that A lot of factors work for and against international schools that go beyond the schools themselves. So this could be the country's economy, it could be the number of expats coming in, it could also be factors like natural disasters. For example, when the earthquake hit in 2011, this was a major event for expats and international schools because many expat families left and never returned. So this affected the overall dynamic of all international schools. Schools became much more Japanese, less diverse, and things have never really changed since then. So international schools today, compared to 10, 20 years ago, have many more Japanese nationals than they did in the past. So, although expat numbers have dwindled, new schools do continue to emerge. You have schools like Tokyo International School and K International School that came about just within the last 20 years. You have schools like YS that continue to grow in size. You have schools like APPI up in Iwate that was only built a few years ago. So there are new international schools emerging, despite the fact that expat numbers seem to continue to drop in Japan.
I'm just adding this point in the editing process. To confirm, when I say expats, I don't mean just like any non-Japanese coming in, but I mean specifically expatriates who come from corporations, large companies from places like Europe, United States primarily, where they are getting, a huge expatriate package, which would include tuition at an international school. So when I say less expats, that's what I mean. I'm not talking about just in general, like foreigners coming into Japan.
So, what's to come? You never know, right? Markets change, countries change, but overall, aforementioned, the big trend is definitely fewer and fewer expats, which does affect the diversity of schools. Specifically, as an educator, too, I would say one of the greatest concerns is the packages for teachers in Japan are just not quite as appealing as neighboring countries like Korea or China. And we do definitely see a lot of teachers, especially those who have the freedom to leave Japan, going to schools like American School of Doha, Singapore American School, and I think schools in Japan right now are struggling to retain great teachers because their packages just are not comparable to schools that would be otherwise seen as their equals, at the international school scene. So that would be another concern I would have, kind of specifically from the educator's mindset. So I've shared with you a variety of ways of looking at schools, whether AP scores, SAT scores, IB scores, student population, campus size. There's a multitude of ways of measuring schools, and I think ultimately, just like how high school students pick colleges for best fit, it's the same thing for teenagers choosing international schools. It's what school best fits their needs. If a student is really into musicals and plays, you want to go to a school that has, a decent sized theater and a good number of students. If your child needs one-on-one attention and maybe will excel more outside of the hustle and bustle of the Tokyo atmosphere, or maybe it's good to put them a little outside of where all the action is in a place like UWC. And of course, tuition plays a big role. There is such thing as bang for your buck. I think there are some schools that, based on the various measurements, do indicate that they are in some ways quote unquote better. But then the question would become, do those schools merit that extra $10,000, $20,000 per year, especially when you need to save up for your child's college tuition as well. So there you have it. Again, I try to base this video as much as I can on data and objective perspective when comparing the international school scene in Japan.
I am aware that the emphasis was on high school. There are, of course, great middle school and elementary school programs throughout Japan. But again, those are even more difficult to measure school to school because those schools don't have things like IB scores or SAT scores, AP scores, etc. So on that note, again, this was an interesting experiment. I hope the information is helpful. And my purpose is not to advocate specifically for one school over another school, but just simply provide people with this information and data, and hopefully parents can make the correct decision for their children. So that's it from me. That is episode 86 of a mini 3 to 4 part series where I'm not interviewing people. from Tokyo Alumni Podcast. Thank you for your time.